All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Today's program is Japanese Voices of Angel Island with Professor Charles Egan. My name is Melissa Bailey-Mihei. I'm Program Development Associate here at the National Japanese American Historical Society. And next, I'd like to introduce the two executive directors of today's partnering organization. First, I'd like to introduce Ed Tepworn, who's the Executive Director of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. And also, I'd like to introduce Rosalind Tonai, Executive Director of the National Japanese American Historical Society. So I'm going to pass over the mic to our two partnering organizations, who will then introduce our presenter for today. All right, first, I guess, Ed.
Thanks so much, Melissa, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's presentation. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, we are the primary nonprofit organization partnering with Angel Island State Park to help preserve the buildings at the historical site, as well as to uplift its histories and stories. We're so excited to be joining you today for today's program and want to send a hearty congratulations to Professor Egan for this momentous, monumental undertaking. All of you are in store for a tremendous treat today. And we're so proud to be co-hosting, and we appreciate the allyship with Rosalind and with the National Japanese Historical Society. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. It's a wonderful partnership. I wanted to say hello to everyone, good morning, and quickly introduce our guest speaker. Professor Charles H. Egan is Professor of Chinese and currently Chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Literature at San Francisco State University. He received his BA from Yale University and went to school with my husband, Grant Din, and his cousin, Bob Egan, and we won't hold that against you, okay?
Thank you.
And holds a PhD in classical Chinese poetry from Princeton. He has published extensively on the evolution of Chinese classical poetic genres and is a frequent translator. His book, Clouds Thick, Whereabouts Unknown, Poems by Zen Monks of China, Columbia University Press, was awarded the 2011 Lucien Strike Prize in Asian Translation by the American Literary Translators Association. His latest publication, Voices of Angel Island, Inscriptions and Immigrant Poetry, 1910 to 1945, includes translations of more than 6 different languages on the walls of Angel Island Immigration Station, located in the San Francisco Bay. For this book talk, we've invited Professor Egan to speak about some of the inscriptions and stories of Japanese immigrants and World War II internees at Angel Island. Without further ado, Professor Egan.
Thank you very much, Rosalind and Ed, for that really nice introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here. And many thanks to the National Japanese American Historical Society and the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation for co-sponsoring this event. What I wanted to talk about today is a very long-term project. I've been working on this book for maybe more than 15 years. After I was part of a consulting group that joined the restoration efforts way back starting in 2003, and I got hooked on the building. So finding out what all of these inscriptions meant a lot to me. It was a great experience, a lot of tedium, but I'm very good at tedium. So I think that it's good work that I hope that people will take to heart. So why don't I start sharing my screen and start our discussions. The Angel Island Immigration Station officially opened its doors on January 21st, 1910. Though often called the Ellis Island of the West, in fact, the site never became a portal like its eastern counterpart. Instead, it functioned as a detention center for all the years of its operation and had been built in large part to discourage Asian immigration. Those arriving at the port of San Francisco, whose status was not in question and whose papers were in order, were processed at the wharves where the passenger ships docked. Problem cases were sent to Angel Island, where the wait for adjudication could last a few days or many months. The old station barracks contains an extraordinary archive. Hundreds of poems and prose records in multiple languages are on the walls. It's inscribed by immigrant detainees between 1910 and 1940 and by POWs and enemy aliens during World War II. Chinese remains the dominant language on the walls, but Japanese is also strongly represented, and Russian, English, Spanish, Italian, French, German, Punjabi, Bengali, and Korean are also found. The Chinese writing at the station is widely known and is compelling because so much of it is poetry. Chinese detainees expressed their feelings of sadness, anger, and hope in scores of poems in classical forms. A group of 135 of these Chinese poems, augmented by individual stories of immigrants and a capsule history of the Chinese experience at the immigration station, formed the 1980 collection, Island, Poetry and History of Chinese Immigrants on Angel Island, by Him Mark Lai, Jenny Lim, and Judy Young. A revised edition was published in 2014. The book is a classic in the history of the immigration experience, and many of the issues it raises concerning policies of exclusion, racial and cultural bias, fear of the immigrant other, and institutionalized inequality are as topical today as they were when it was published or when the poems were written. Yet the book was so influential that many members of the public think of Angel Island only in the context of Chinese American history. My new book, Voices of Angel Island, aims to broaden that view by transcribing and researching a selection of wall inscriptions in all the languages represented there, augmented by literary materials from Bay Area ethnic newspapers. Historians Erica Lee and Judy Young estimate that 300,000 aliens were sent to Angel Island for immigration inspection between 1910 and 1940. 100,000 Chinese, 85,000 Japanese, 8,000 South Asians, 8,000 Russians and Jews, 1,000 Koreans, 1,000 Filipinos, and 400 Mexicans. Other immigrants were from Australia and New Zealand, the Polynesian Islands, Southeast Asia, Europe, South and Central America. People of 80 nationalities entering the port of San Francisco all ended up at Angel Island, sent there when the authorities deemed that their entry applications required investigation. Voices of Angel Island adds many more Chinese inscriptions to the record and has separate chapters on Japanese, Korean, and European and other immigrants, as well as a chapter on Angel Island in World War II. Each text tells the story of an individual, but taken together, they illuminate historical, economic, and cultural forces that shaped the lives of ordinary people in the early 20th century. Today, my focus is the Japanese inscriptions at Angel Island and the people who wrote them. There are more than a dozen wall inscriptions from the immigration period found in the small dormitories and sitting rooms that were reserved for Japanese and Europeans. Although simple and prosaic, names, places, etc., some are specific enough to have allowed me to discover the family stories of the writers and make contact with their descendants. Unlike the Chinese detainees, Japanese detainees in the 1910 to 1940 period did not carve poems on the station walls, but hundreds and hundreds of poems that describe Angel Island and the immigration experience were published in Japanese newspapers in California. Prose pieces that provide a personal view of the American experience also were frequently included. I'd like to read a selection of poems and prose published between 1910 and 1924 in the Japanese language newspaper Nichibei Shimbun, the Japanese American News. Its descendant today is the Nichibei Foundation and the Nichibei Weekly newspaper. These materials allow us to hear the voices of the Issei once again. Finally, there are multiple inscriptions in Japanese from the World War II period by both Japanese Hawaiians and Japanese prisoners of war. These will be described in turn. For Japanese immigrants, the so-called Gentleman's Agreement of 1907 to 1908 was the major factor governing immigration practices until 1924. Immigration of Japanese had been relatively free since 1894 under the terms of the US-Japan Treaty of Commerce and Navigation, and the number of Japanese workers in California, Oregon, and Washington had swelled, particularly in agriculture. The territory of Hawaii attracted even larger numbers. 30,000 Japanese contract laborers were there by 1885. By the early 20th century, anti-Japanese sentiment had also grown. The Asiatic Exclusion League, a powerful voice for restricting immigration through to the end of World War II, in fact, was founded in 1905 as the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League. In 1906, the school board in San Francisco voted to ban Japanese and Korean children from public schools that served the general population, and instead required them to attend a newly established Oriental public school along with Chinese children. The Japanese government was offended by this and other acts of discrimination, and so entered negotiations on the immigration issue with President Theodore Roosevelt. Japan agreed not to issue passports to any more laborers intending to immigrate to the continental US or the territory of Hawaii. Professional classes were exempt, as were those laborers returning to a domicile or farm formerly held. While Roosevelt agreed to intervene in the San Francisco school plan and not move forward on a formal exclusion law aimed at the Japanese. A key exception in the agreement was to have far-reaching consequences. Parents, spouses, and children of Japanese residents in the US could be allowed passports and entry. One unanticipated result from the US perspective was the coming of the picture brides and the ensuing growth of the Japanese community. Young women in Japan were legally married to absent bridegrooms residing in the United States, often with their only previous contact, the exchange of photographs and correspondence. The new brides then were given valid passports to travel to this country to meet their husbands. The Japanese government watched over the system. All prospective bridegrooms had to meet a financial standard in mid-1915 set at $800 in savings. Brides had to be officially registered with their bridegroom's household in Japan at least 6 months before they could travel abroad, and could not be more than 13 years younger than their spouses. US authorities were at first perplexed by the practice and how to reconcile it with domestic marriage law. Between 1910 and 1920, when Japan agreed to stop issuing passports to picture brides, the so-called Ladies' Agreement, between 6,000 and 10,000 were processed through Angel Island, in addition to the thousands of Japanese men who applied for entry through various exemptions. Nearly 20,000 picture brides settled in Hawaii in about the same period. At the insistence of the Immigration Service, grooms were required to come in person to Angel Island to meet their brides. The thought of the many happy meetings that occurred there partially counterbalances the weight of heartache of Angel Island detainees. The opening of the Angel Island immigration station coincided with a transitional period for the Japanese community. As the scholar Yuji Ichioka explains, the history of Japanese immigration can be divided into two broad periods, 1885 to 1907 and 1908 to 1924. The first is characterized by the dekasegi ideal, which refers to the practice of Japanese laborers leaving their homes temporarily to work elsewhere. Implicit was the idea that the workers would return home to Japan later. Japanese in California at this period were predominantly laborers who engaged in railroad construction or agricultural work, often living in primitive and temporary camps, kyampu, in rural areas. Populated at first entirely by men, life there was harsh, and leisure was often devoted to drinking and gambling. Subsequent to the gentleman's agreement, visionary community leaders like Kyotaro Abiko, founder and publisher of the Nichibei Shimbun, called for dochaku eiju, settlement of the land and permanent residency. A campaign in the newspaper railed against drinking and gambling in the camps and encouraged picture bride marriages and self-sufficiency through agriculture. Abiko and his associates went so far as to purchase land in the Central Valley to foster Japanese utopian agricultural colonies. They bought 3,200 acres of land in Livingston, California, and founded the Yamato colony in 1907. Two more colonies were established nearby, Cressy in 1918 and Cortez in 1919. Although life in the colonies was grueling at first, the experiment was ultimately successful. Many descendants of the first hardy pioneers still farm the land there. The amount of land cultivated by Japanese immigrant farmers expanded greatly in the 1910s. Yet a great blow was the 1913 California Alien Land Law, and in particular, a stricter 1920 version approved by a ballot initiative, which prohibited aliens ineligible for citizenship from purchasing agricultural land, bequeathing or selling it to other immigrants, or leasing it for periods longer than 3 years. The law was further strengthened in 1923. The expansion of the Japanese presence in agriculture was effectively curtailed. Between 1920 and 1930, the number of Japanese-operated farms in California fell about 25%, and the number of acres farmed fell almost 50%. Another major blow was the World War II internment of West Coast Japanese Americans. At war's end, many Japanese American farmers, particularly those who relied on leased land, were unable to resume farming. By 1950, Japanese Americans in California were farming almost the same numbers as in number of acres as in 1910. The combined effect of the alien land laws and the internment precipitated a migration of Japanese Americans to the cities. The California alien land law was finally repealed by popular vote, but not until 1956. Changes in US law closed the window on almost all Asian immigration. The Immigration Act of 1917 created an Asiatic barred zone, which covered South and Southeast Asia, the Polynesian Islands, Asiatic Russia, and parts of Arabia and Afghanistan. The act effectively broadened the Chinese Exclusion Act to cover all these localities. Japan was not included. It was an ally in World War I, but this was to change. The Immigration Act of 1924 included a provision that barred entry to any person who was not eligible for naturalization, which effectively excluded Japanese without having to mention them specifically. Now, I'd like to move on now to taking a look at some of the inscriptions from the immigration period in the building. Now, this first one actually is not in the station barracks, but it came from the hospital in the Asian men's ward. So side by side here on the wall are two dates, both reign period names. The 44th year of Meiji for the Meiji Emperor, which refers to 1911, and the third year of Xuantong. Xuantong was the Chinese emperor, the last emperor, Puyi. These are the earliest Asian inscriptions in the building, or at the station. This is only from 1 year later. It's a pretty big inscription. It's kind of hard to photograph, as you can see. So Miyamoto from Nukui District, Kawauchi Village, Asa County, Hiroshima Prefecture, 45th year of Meiji, 1912. This carving was made by Masaru Miyamoto, who was only a teenager at the time when he arrived with his mother Mitsuyo Miyamoto on the SS Mongolia on June 17th of that year. Masaru and Mitsuyo were traveling to join husband and father Chiokichi Miyamoto, a farmer in Fresno County. Yet both were detained at Angel Island for several weeks for treatment of uncinariasis, hookworm. They were finally admitted on July 5th. Miyamoto was not Chiokichi's original name. He was born Jusaburo Kuramoto, but he was adopted by the Tamihei Miyamoto and family, probably because they had no son that could inherit. This was not the last of the name changes in this family. When Chiokichi and Mitsuyo decided to immigrate to Hawaii in 1895, they found that their applicants from their village were subject to a waiting period before wives could join their husbands. So Chiokichi borrowed the name of an acquaintance from a nearby village that did not require a waiting period. The 1900 US Census finds Asaburo and Mitsuyo Hokuda, whose ages match those of Chiokichi and Mitsuyo Miyamoto, seen in other records, living in North Kohala on the Big Island of Hawaii, along with their 3-year-old son, Masaru Hokuda. The Kohala region, comprising North and South Kohala, is the northernmost part of the Big Island. It was a major producer of sugar, and a cane plantation is apparently where Asaburo Chiokichi worked. The census describes him as a field laborer, while Mitsuyo took in sewing. 3 other children were born to the couple in Hawaii subsequently. In 1908, Chiokichi relocated to California, and the family followed soon after. By 1920, he and Mitsuyo were farming in the Vinland Precinct of Fresno Township, and 3 of their children were with them, and a couple of others were off in school and or had already been married. The Hokuda name is nowhere to be seen. By October 1920, Masaru Miyamoto had married. His new bride, Kinyo Miyamoto, whose birth name was Shimonishi, had also been born in Hawaii and was from a farming family in Fresno. The Shimonishi family returned for a time to Japan, and Kinyo and her elder sister spent their childhoods there. In 1918, Kinyo returned to California with her father, Taichi Shimonishi, a farmer in Clovis, Fresno County. Kinyo and Masaru's marriage was arranged. She told the story of their first meeting to the family in 1986. One day she was riding her bicycle in Fresno when an old friend of her father, acting as matchmaker, drove by and offered her a ride. Masaru and his father Chiokichi were also in the car. Kinyo had no idea she was being checked out. Masaru decided to make a trip back to Hawaii to locate his birth records because the alien land laws were in effect, and he wanted to be able to prove US citizenship in order to buy land. In Hawaii, however, he found his birth certificate was in the name of Masaru Hokuda. Rather than fight City Hall and attempt to have his name changed, he adopted the Hokuda surname and kept it for the rest of his life. The couple remained in Euro Fresno, and their 4 children were all born there. Then in the late 1920s, the family relocated to Los Angeles, where Masaru found work as a gardener and raised the family. In World War II, after President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066 for the internment of Japanese West Coast Japanese Americans, the Hokudas were uprooted and sent to the Gila River War Relocation Center on the Gila River Indian Reservation, about 40 miles southeast of Phoenix, Arizona. At its peak, Gila River held 13,348 detainees when it was only designed for 10,000. Despite the harsh desert environment, the detainees created a flourishing community complete with cultural, civic, and religious institutions, which they ran almost entirely by themselves. They were allowed out in late 1943 for work release. They found sponsors in Ohio and in Michigan that would take members of the family for working mostly farm work. Towards the end of the war, all 3 of Masaru and Kinyo's sons joined the U.S. military. The eldest joined military intelligence. The second son, Hideo, was sent to Europe, where he was a guard at the Nuremberg trials of the major Nazi political and military leaders. At war's end, Masaru and Kinyo returned to Los Angeles, bought a home, and restarted the gardening business. In August 1989, when Masaru and Kinyo were residents of the Keiro Japanese retirement home in downtown Los Angeles, they and other residents were featured in a New York Times story about the delay in payment of reparations to former Second World War Japanese American internees. This is the picture that ran in the New York Times. But yet 1 year later, not a single payment had been forthcoming. In the article, Kinyo is quoted as saying, "We trust America, but we doubt. We expect the American government to give to us, but too long over the years now. We doubt, we are not sure now." The article concludes with the following quote by Kinyo. "40 years ago, we had a struggle, yes, but we managed it because my husband is a hardworking man," Mrs. Hokuda said. "We had a bitter experience, but are still loyal to the United States, that's for sure." The Masaru died in 1995 and Kinyo in 1999. Now, the hometown of Masaru itself tells a tragic story. He was from Nikui, which is part of Kawauchi village, but which is outside of the city of Hiroshima, and should have been well clear of the Hiroshima atomic blast. However, on the day of the atomic bomb explosion, the civilian corps from Nikui had been called into the city center to do demolition work, and over 200 members of the same 200 people from that one village were all killed. There's a memorial to them in Peace Park in Hiroshima. Meanwhile, Masaru's younger sister, Misao, had been born in Fresno, but married another Japanese immigrant and moved back to Japan. And she was living in the Hiroshima prefecture area. She and her husband and daughter went into town that day, and all were killed by the blast, as was Kinyo's father, who had retired back to Hiroshima. One particularly ironic thing to me is that this is Masaru's inscription. This was his experience. Only 15 feet away was an inscription by a Russian writer whose son worked on the Manhattan Project. I think there's quite a bit of irony in that position. Now, this is the Hokuda family a few years ago when they all came out to Angel Island. There I am on the right, and they actually came twice, including his daughter Teruko, Aunt Terry, who was quite elderly but still made the trip. Here's an inscription that is of a person who has no record at Angel Island. He has a record at Ellis Island. Kinzo Tsujitaka was a merchant seaman, and the record from New York is that he jumped ship, and then he appears appears at Angel Island months later. I hope he had a good time in between traveling the country. But he came back to Angel Island presumably to be deported. The Hamaguchi Isaburo was a fisherman from Mie Prefecture, and one of a large number of Hamaguchis, all fishermen from Mie, who came to Southern California and then to Mexico in the early teens. Is racial bias justifiable? And this is a person from Kagawa Prefecture, Yamashita. Get me out of here fast. This is almost certainly by Tsurukichi Yamashita from Kusakabe on the inland sea of Shiroshima, Kagawa Prefecture. He and his wife Nao and daughter Kimie arrived in 1915. They were on their way to join Father Matsukichi Yamashita, a foreman and tenant farmer on the Irvine Ranch in Orange County, California. This is a picture taken not so long after their arrival. Now, Yamashita was not Tsurukichi's birth name. It was his wife Nao's birth name. And so he married into the family, presumably because there was no male in the family who could inherit. They worked in Irvine for a number of years, but with the alien land laws getting so onerous, their parents, or Nao's parents, decided to retire and move back to Japan. Tsurukichi and Nao and family, a growing family, they eventually had 12 children, stayed in Irvine for a while, but then gave it up and they moved to a farm, sight unseen, in Overton, Nevada, where they purchased farmland. Times were hard, but they prospered, producing cantaloupes, tomatoes, cucumbers, and other crops, and raising turkeys for sale in Las Vegas. Their son, Jimmy Yamashita, later recalled that the small local community was tolerant and supportive of their new neighbors, and were always ready to lend a helping hand. Even though there was a language barrier, it didn't prevent us becoming an integral part of the community. Jimmy was even elected student body president of Moapa Valley High School in 1941. Once the war began, several of the children of Tsurukichi and Nao joined the US military. In May 1942, elder son Shigeru, or Shig Yamashita, shipped out for New Caledonia, where he joined the Americall Division. He served as a military translator for the unit throughout the Pacific War, participating in operations in New Caledonia, Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and the Philippines. He was awarded both the Bronze Star and the Legion of Merit. Jimmy joined the Army in 1943 and became a platoon leader in the renowned 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up almost entirely of Japanese American soldiers, for its exploits in multiple major battles of the European War, including the rescue of the Lost Battalion. The 442nd became the most decorated unit in American history. Now, I think I'd like to switch over now and talk about materials that come from the Nichibei Shimbun. Poems and literary materials were published regularly in Nichibei. Many were submitted by readers and then were selected by the editors for publication. Others were likely written by the editors and staff themselves. The topics cover the gamut of Japanese immigrant life in the period: Angel Island and Picture Brides, homesickness for Japan, perspectives on San Francisco and California life and scenery, farm work in the Central Valley, and complaints about discriminatory laws and treatment. A particular focus is on life in camp. Camp refers to any of the temporary work camps in the Central Valley where Japanese migrant laborers found themselves. Yet camp in Nichibei also refers to the Yamato colony and similar settlements. Many poems document the arrival of wives, the coming of children, and the pride that settlers felt when they saw their heavy labors come to fruition. Taken as a whole, the text revealed the joys and travails of the Issei as they created something new and permanent. When the Japanese American experience is discussed in the media these days, invariably the focus is on the tragedy of the World War II internment. Yet the Issei experience that these texts represent predates that. Their lives were hard, they were homesick for Japan, and they encountered bias and discrimination, but at the same time, they remained focused on building new lives here. The emotions they expressed in the poems and prose selections were mixed, but chief among them was hope. I wanted to read, I found two diaries about Angel Island detainment in the Nichibei Shimbun. I just want to read you a few excerpts from these. The first one is by Masanosuke Yasui, who came to America in 1915. The same time that the Pan-Pacific exhibition was going on in San Francisco. He was a candy maker, and he was coming to work at the Sugaya store on Post Street in Japantown. But he was ordered deported because the authorities didn't think that he was coming here to work. They were coming here to visit. They thought he was coming here to work and to immigrate. So he arrives, he says, July 21st, clear and windy skies. The customs officials started inspecting the luggage at about 8 o'clock. Arrived at Angel Island at 1 p.m. The trees and shrubs on the mountains behind the immigration station are luxuriant, and the clipped grass in the courtyard is verdant green. Moss rose, hydrangea, hollyhock, and other flowers vie with each other in bloom, and somehow remind me of my home country. We were escorted to a large room on the second floor. Both sides of the corridors were covered in thick iron mesh. Not only the windows, but also the walkways to the toilets and bath were covered in this way. Somebody said, it's as if we'd been put in prison. Similar sentiments could be heard from others all around me. Weary of more than 20 monotonous days of life at sea, my joy at seeing the beautiful blooming flowers and scenery turns to sadness at my captivity in this prison-like place. After 2 p.m., I was told it was time for the midday meal. Went to the dining hall. Rice and a cooked dish were mounded up in separate metal tubs. The porcelain bowls looked like Buddhist begging bowls and were covered with red and black tea stains. I put rice and some of the cooked dish in 2 separate bowls and picked up a bit with my chopsticks and tasted. The rice was Saigon rice and it had a foul smell. The cooked dish was glistening fat on top of some unknown green vegetable and pork meat. The vegetables were half cooked and tasted of salt. Ugh, we all said in disgust. At this point, I put down my chopsticks and returned to my room. It seemed that the others left without eating as well. July 22nd, thick fog. At 8 o'clock, we all went to the hospital where each person was given a basin with a numbered tally in it. We wrote the numbers of our tallies on our ship tickets and gave them to the guard. Then we had to leave fecal samples in the basins. We were told to wait in a small courtyard surrounded by iron mesh until everyone was finished. Then we had eye examinations, and when those were finished, we were led to a room where we were told to take off our shirts. We waited until a doctor came to check our lungs. Then we were lined up, and one after another, the doctor examined our private parts behind a screen. Eventually, he decides to cancel his appeal to stay and return to Japan. His sort of last entry reads as follows. Every day, as many as 5 groups of foreigners, both men and women, come to observe. It's unpleasant for me to see the manner of these young women chattering and laughing loudly. Although such behavior may be typical in the West, in the eyes of Orientals, it looks to be terribly lacking in manners. Someone said we had better dress our best, because if they see Orientals dressed like we are now, they will go back and use it as evidence for Japanese exclusion. It was not our intention to stay in such a place for long, so we hadn't prepared anything. Yet they come to observe us, and what's more, use what they see as evidence for Japanese exclusion. So I think that Americans are heartless and shallow. The rage of the Chinese. At dinner on August 7th, the Chinese men began to riot because of the food. They broke their rice bowls and threw rice everywhere, and it was wild and disorderly. In the end, they went up to the 2nd floor without eating. After the women had finished their meal, the men were calmed down and were called back again to eat. I think they made use of American ways really well. If Japanese people had known how to apply such methods in diplomacy, then I think that Japanese-American problems would have been solved long ago. In the evening, many of the Chinese brought out musical instruments and they were all jumping around. I guess they were probably celebrating their victory. I think I'm going to jump ahead and read some of the poetry from the station. A Night at Angel Island. In a stone prison on Angel Island, a Japanese girl is crying, leaving muddy streaks on her pale face as she clings to a chill window. From the chill window, what can be seen? Pale, eerie moonlight that keeps her from sleep. From the chill window, what can be heard? Dreamlike in the distance, white gulls faintly cry, the lingering sound of tears. A Japanese girl is crying, clinging to a chill window, muddy streaks on her face in a stone prison on Angel Island. She sends a wireless telegram to her picture husband and waits at the ship, hoping he will come. She is worried she'll be rejected by her husband, whose face and heart she has never seen. Although he said this season is not the best, she has counted on her fingers, and this is the joyful month. For the sake of her husband's success, she's taken jobs she's not used to, washing dishes and scrubbing floors. She yearns for her beloved husband in the picture, yet upon arrival, she sees only the heartless immigration official. Watching a friend send her children back to Japan. Her face is desolate with loneliness as she sends off her infant child, who knows nothing except love for his parents. She is grief-stricken by the love of her child, who is now walking away into the dim light of a second-class stateroom. Born subject of the emperor, we live in a foreign land. At the new year, we make a toast. May your reign last forever. Camp and colony. In camp, men cook and men dance. It's spring everywhere. Staying up all night in camp, I'm getting used to the sound of mosquitoes. My first attempt at digging potatoes on a cold morning. Cold morning, the dew in a night has rusted the farm tools. Camp. Plum leaves are falling in San Jose. in the last gleams of a pale setting sun. In the distance, from the top of a bush, the broken cries of a shrike. In our corner of the tiny storeroom, I've grown tired of hearing Chico's stories of the strong liquors and the women. I wonder what the San Francisco night is really like. Only 5 o'clock and already the sun is gone. Somehow my world seems so small. I light the kerosene lamp and cook the meal. I'm on duty tomorrow. These attacks of rain and frost, the tomatoes won't stand them for long. I hated leaving my old hometown, but I'm worried about my future. As I hear the sound of the train whistle, I take off my dusty, sweaty shirt. Tomorrow may see frost, for tonight I feel a cold wind. When the new bride arrives in camp, the flowers bloom. Married couples divide the room with sheets before sleep. In a leaky tent by lantern light, a woman makes sushi. Pioneer. I cleared 100 acres of land with just my own arms under the 120-degree sun, far removed from society. The bounty wrought by the sweat of my skin has come to naught. The crop has rotted in the fields. It's another great failure. From pennilessness, without help from anyone, I raised myself up. Now to pennilessness I've returned. There's no mystery to it. With my wife and children, there are 6 of us. But after tomorrow, how will we eat? If we cannot eat, then eat this flesh of mine. Under the 120-degree sun, having just my thin arms as my stake. As a pioneer of our race, in the field of brambles, I made the flowers bloom. By Okusuke, Imperial Valley. First letter of the new year to your parents in the old country, adding a picture of our newborn baby. In the immigrant schoolhouse, singing of the boundless spring of the imperial rain. Okay, I think I'd like to switch over now to talk a bit about World War II. Now, the burning of the administration building in 1940 effectively put an end to the station's usefulness as an immigration processing center. The entire Angel Immigration Station site was turned over to the US Army in 1941, and it became the North Garrison of nearby Fort McDowell. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the detention barracks were quickly brought back into use by the new management. The site was prepared to house military prisoners, yet not all were prisoners of war. The forced internment of Japanese Americans from the West Coast is a well-known and tragic story. Approximately 120,000 people in California, Oregon, and Washington were forced to leave their homes and relocate to camps operated in remote parts of the western states by the newly established War Relocation Authority. Those interned by the WRA did not transit the old Angel Island Immigration Station site, but the station was a stop for hundreds of Japanese internees from Hawaii. The relocation and internment of Japanese from Hawaii is not well known outside the islands. Immediately after the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941, local authorities and the FBI arrested over 1,000 Issei first-generation community leaders. The number eventually rose to more than 2,000. The arrests were not random. In light of the possibility of hostilities with Japan, the FBI and military had begun preparing custodial detention name lists several years before. These people spent the rest of the war as enemy alien prisoners. 2 major US Army camps were established in Hawaii, Sand Island in Honolulu Harbor, and Honolulu, about 20 miles to the west. Yet 10 large groups of prisoners comprising 699 people were transported to the mainland between February 1942 and December 1943. The first mainland stop for most of these people was Angel Island. There are multiple inscriptions by these prisoners at the barracks. After transiting Angel Island, they spent the rest of the war in Department of Justice or Army camps in the interior. Prisoners of war held in the old barracks include the first captured in the war, the commander of a midget submarine at Pearl Harbor, Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki. Yet no other Japanese military prisoners arrived until summer 1942, after the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. mirroring the progress of the war. Initially, most prisoners of war held at Angel Island were Germans from the North Africa campaign. At war's end, about 400 Japanese POWs were detained at the island. Some 24 inscriptions by them are on the barracks walls. Finally, the end of the war began what was to be the final official task performed at the Angel Island Immigration Station, the repatriation of Japanese POWs. Repatriation happened quite quickly, and those being sent home left more than a dozen inscriptions on the wall. This is a Japanese Hawaiian inscription. The group number 3 is the third group of the 10 groups of Japanese Hawaiians who were transported through the station. Of 110 persons from the group number 3 boat, 8 are from Waialua. Everything's arranged. Everyone is well. It's almost certain we are leaving for someplace in Texas after lunch on June 4th, 17th year. They actually went to New Mexico. This is a haiku poem written by one of these Japanese Hawaiians. The expectation that one day will bring escape, cold, bleak. June 4th, as a prisoner, Hilo City, Shindo. Shindo was Takuji Shindo, who ran a drugstore in Hilo. He was a prominent local businessman, and he was picked up and right after Pearl Harbor, and was sent eventually to Lordsburg, New Mexico. And let me tell you. Let's see. Let me read you something by him. Where is it? Here we go. Yeah, because when he was interrogated, they asked him questions like this. Just give you a couple samples. Being a subject of Japan, I presume you are a loyal subject? Answer, I cannot say that I'm a loyal subject of Japan because I arrived here when I was 17 or 18 years old, and I have not done anything for the Japanese government. On the other hand, I've made this my permanent residence, and I have enjoyed all the freedom and liberty offered me, and I'm a loyal American that does not have the citizenship status. Well, why then, through the course of many years in the United States, have you adhered so strictly to Japanese customs and practice? Whatever I have done for the community at large and not particularly for the Japanese, et cetera, et cetera. And a portrait of him was done by George Hoshida while at Lordsburg. This is Takuji Shindo at left. This is now at the Japanese National Museum in Los Angeles. This is also by a Japanese Hawaiian. He was the owner of the Oriental jewelry store in Honolulu. I identified him as Robert Sueoka. He was also in the same group with Takuji Shindo. Prisoner of war inscriptions. All those captured at Attu Island, whereabouts unknown. We arrived here on September 12th. We did not find our place of death. We were captured and are detained here. 19th year of Showa, South Pacific Archipelago. A cartoon by a Japanese POW. Every heart in the great Japanese empire thinks of victory. We must win. Long live the great Japanese empire. Stupid Yankees by Jisei. Yankee no Baka. All those at the airport works on Saipan and Tinian Islands kept up their spirits to the end. I'm leaving in February of next year. And this is a little POW diary. On July 3rd, 19th year of Showa, we left New Caledonia. On the 24th of the same month, during daytime, we arrived at the port of San Francisco. On the 25th, we disembarked the ship and came to the holding center. PW, 39 persons. August 2nd morning, 10 persons left for an unnamed destination. August 5th before noon, 20 persons left for an unnamed location. August 5th afternoon, 9 persons left for an unknown vacation. Overthrow America and Britain. The landing on the American mainland is near. This one is written in the form of a poem. The love in our hearts for our parents cannot match the depth of our parents' love for us. What will they think when they learn our fates? The first part of it is an exact quote from the death poem of Yoshida Shoin, an influential intellectual and teacher who was executed in the 19th century by the Tokugawa shogunate. Yoshida's poem concludes, how will they take the news of today? The POW writer gives his own variation of Yoshida's conclusion. That he models his inscription on a death poem suggests that he sees death and capture as equivalent. Finally, this is by post-war detainees. As there were about a dozen, mostly rather mundane inscriptions by people being repatriated. They were leaving notes for each other, saying like, on such and such a day, 600 people will be leaving, for Japan. We're leaving for Yokohama. Greetings to Sergeant Takeda, et cetera, et cetera. This is the most interesting of them. The time has come for me to fulfill my duty. I think that until it becomes clear whether or not the separation of life and death will come between us, I will hold strongly to the proper course. I pray you will make strong efforts. More than 600 persons are leaving on November 7th. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor Egan. We're going to go a little bit longer if we can to entertain some of the questions, if you don't mind. And it's just fascinating. Sure. Thank you. This book is just an excellent book. I just want to let people know it's an easy read. You can probably see it in there in the slides, but it's an easy read and it's a fascinating read. The research is just incredible. And I just want to start.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. This, you could tell this is truly a labor of love. I understand it spanned over 15 years, just the research. And it, of course, just not the Chinese inscription, but there's Japanese, you said Korean, Punjabi, Russian. So what motivated you to write this book?
Well, I joined this consulting group back in the Restoration in the early 2000s, and we were tasked to look at both the Chinese poems on the walls, which were known through the book Island, and they were asked to find if there was other stuff there that hadn't been published before, right? And we found massive amounts of stuff that had not been published before. Very difficult to read because the walls are so degraded. We did a preliminary report and we found quite a few new Chinese poems and inscriptions, but weren't able at that time to completely decipher very many of them. And then there were just all of the other languages that had never been studied before. And I love inscriptions. I love deciphering things. One of my favorite subjects in the Chinese world is calligraphy. So I got hooked, and I just sort of kept plugging away at it, trying to make out what was really there on the walls. So it's a form of archaeology, I guess. It's like trying to see through all of that paint and putty that are on the walls. I use the metaphor that it's like trying to read stuff written in the sand on the beach after a wave is washed over it. So I had a lot of help. Because I don't speak 8 languages, so I can make my way with Japanese. I studied in graduate school, but I also had great help from my colleague at San Francisco State, Makiko Asano, who worked with me on the poetry readings particularly, and I had help with the Korean chapter in the same way. But a lot of what I was doing was, once I got the texts and then did translations, the next step was doing the research and being able to follow names through public records down to living descendants was really gratifying to me.
That's incredible. Yes, I think that the inscriptions written by the Japanese immigrants are probably not as prolific, right, as the Chinese ones. And
right.
And can you explain some of that? I mean, Was it because of the sheer numbers of Japanese immigrants that were not as much as Chinese, or their type of detention, or their social economic status or station in life?
There were two things going on there. One is that the Japanese did not tend to be detained for very long. That's because the Japanese government and the U.S. government had sort of an understanding that Japan would not give people passports unless they were legit, right? So the average length of stay for a Japanese person there was really not more than a couple, 3 days, right? Whereas the Chinese were often there for months. Because of the Chinese exclusion laws. The second thing
years,
about
years, as you said, right? Sometimes years.
up to that, yeah. The other thing is that the Chinese, for cultural reasons, have a real focus on public poetry, and so leaving like a poetic statement about detention behind was something that sort of had a long tradition in China. That was not the same for other groups that were there. But as I mentioned, that didn't mean that the Japanese were not writing poetry. They wrote it all the time, and they published it in the newspapers rather than carving it on the wall.
And so I'd like to go to Melissa with some questions in the chat. So Melissa, can you read some questions in the chat?
Sure. So our first question came from Daniel. Could you please explain the drawing you have shown? It looks like a child's drawing of a person.
Oh yeah, that one. There were actually a whole bunch of drawings on the walls. Most of them are in the Chinese dormitories, so I didn't show most of those. But I showed you a drawing of a bird, which was quite lovely, and then there was a carving of a rooster, and there was a little, like, probably the one you're talking about is this little doodle.
Yeah.
Those were all found in the hospital, the Asian men's ward. So they were most likely by Japanese patients at the hospital. Yeah. So there's nothing really special about them except they're fun.
Great. So our next question is from Julie. Are there any written immigration records kept at Angel Island that the public would have access to, similar to Ellis Island?
There are lots of public records that are accessible, right? Not at the island right now. Although I think when the restoration of the hospital building is complete, the plan is to put some genealogical resources there. But now what you can what you can do is use ancestry.com. A lot of stuff is there, and then there's also the National Archives in San Bruno. They have a large number of the original case files for immigrants from all the places that came into San Francisco.
Great. So our next question is also continuing the story of immigration from Chelsea. Would every Japanese passenger who arrived in San Francisco before 1940 have been processed at Angel Island?
No, because Angel Island was a detention center, and so a lot of people would have been processed on the wharf in San Francisco, near where the Bay Bridge is now, is where the old Pacific steamers would come in. And so, the people who would be sent to Angel Island would be those who are either suspect. They would send all the picture brides there because they were new to the country, but people who were suspect for some reason, or had no money, or were not a member of the exempt classes. So the numbers of people who were sent to the island is far smaller than the number of people who came into San Francisco.
Got it. So again, continuing on this theme of immigration, our question from Barbara: was Angel Island under the Immigration and Naturalization Service since its inception? Was it ever under the Department of Justice? And now is it under the Department of the Interior?
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting question because the Immigration Nationalization Service has moved around. You know, I think it was Department of Commerce back in the day.
Mhm.
It was part of that group. Um, 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 this site has never been under the Department of Justice. However, these are government agencies, and you know they help each other out. So that even though this is an immigration processing center, enemy aliens were sent there during both World Wars. You know, Germans in World War I, and then Germans and Japanese in World War II, and it was also used for federal prisoners for a while before Alcatraz was opened, and so it seems like, you know, it was a detention facility, and various parts of the government made use of it. Right. It's not under the Department of Interior now because Angel Island's a state park, not a federal park. So it's under the California State Parks system.
Yeah, I understand the waterways, though, is sort of governed by the Department of Interior, though. So I think they were able to get some federal appropriations for some of the studies, early studies.
Yeah.
Great. We have one more question from the audience. This question is from Nobuko. What did you find was your most frustrating moment during your impressive research? And Nobuko very much enjoyed listening to the story and says thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I can't even count the number of frustrating moments that I've had doing this project. One thing that would happen pretty, not infrequently, is I'd get an inscription and I'd almost get it. I'd almost be able to read the thing. There was one thing that I couldn't get, and therefore I can't use it. You know, that's frustrating, especially after you spend some time, you know, on a piece. I wouldn't say this is frustrating, but it is what it is. Is that when I was able to make contact with living descendants of writers, that was always helpful, because you know you would flesh out the real people. You know, you'd learn about personalities, anecdotes about people, things like that. You know, but in many cases, I was able to trace people trace writers in public records, but not get that far, not get down to the present day. So public records are all pretty black and white, you know, and you know, you can sort of say where somebody was, what they were doing for an occupation, but you can't say much about the person. So, you know, as somebody who wants to tell stories, that could be a little bit frustrating.
Yeah, well, this is just a wonderful discussion. I really encourage folks to get the book and just make that splurge, and even donate copies to your local library. Just a plug for the book, you know, Voices of Angel Island is published by Bloomsbury, is now available for sale, and the listed price is the library purchase price. That's why a little steep here. But today there's a special publisher's discount at 35% off. So go to our website and enter the code that's going to be in your chat. And you might want to purchase a few copies and then donate it to your local library or your school and your alma mater. So, but really take a look at this stuff. We want to push it to get the sales up so we can get some in paperback eventually. Right. So, and we'll feel free to try to answer the rest of your questions if you have them, through the email and through the chat. I guess without further ado, this concludes our program, and I will want to have a shout out to, we have a little infomercial at the end, but our next program will be with Gail Okawa, who will sort of tag on to this discussion about World War II incarcerees from Hawaii and tell that story. So that's another great program that we have presented. So thank you, Professor Egan.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate all of you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our funders, San Francisco Grants for the Arts, San Francisco Japantown Foundation, the Henry and Tomoya Takahashi Charitable Foundation, And of course, today's partnering organizations, Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation and the National Japanese American Historical Society. So this concludes today's program. Thank you very much. If you don't mind, we've been dropping a link to the program evaluation in chat. If you could please click on that link and complete the evaluation, we'd really appreciate it. If you do not get the link or have difficulties accessing chat, we will also be emailing out the link. Well, thank you very much, everyone. That concludes today.